Welcome to Humanist Views, a program where we look at current issues from a humanist point of view. On tonight's program, we're going to take a look at things that should be in the headlines, but aren't quite, but you can see them hiding in the fringes if you look for it. We're going to take a look at the idea of science denialism. And this is the case where, here in the US, we've got people who still think that evolution is just a theory, and that global climate change is just something the really freaky people like to talk about. So we're going to take a look at why people look at it that way and how you can educate yourself on how proper science really works and learn to ignore those people who don't know what they're talking about. Joining me on tonight's program is Dr. Greg Layden, and welcome, Greg.
Thanks, Scott. Good to be here.
It's good to have you back. So this topic is one that, doesn't jump out at people, but this program is being taped in November 2011, and the world population just crossed to over 7 billion.
Right.
So we've got issues where we can't be stopping looking at what important science information we need to know to make good policy.
Right. In fact, unless the Mayan calendar is right and the world ends
like a year from now?
In a year from now, or perhaps 11/11/11, which is just coming up.
Well, there is that.
The truth is that science-related issues are the most important issues we have right now. There's all kinds of social issues, there's all kinds of political issues out there, but they all kind of pale in relation to some of the really important science-related issues having to do with climate change and food supply and that sort of thing.
Yeah, because when I've talked with, there's a local guy who runs a population group, and he is now looking at resource management, footprint on the world, and those sort of things when we start talking about population, because most people don't have a clue about any of that when it comes to what's going to end up being part of their day in and day out survival.
Right. It turns out that if you compare productivity, for example, of farms over the last several centuries, the productivity of the average farm in temperate climates has gone up something like 38 times in the last 100 years because of changes in the way that farming is done through scientific research. Mm-hmm. So without having taking a long view and a broad view and a scientific view and a critical view of how we do things and trying to understand them that way, we can't make adjustments for this population size or deal with the population increase in any way. And I'm kind of agnostic on what to do about population size. We sort of hope if you look back at time, every decade or so, Scientific American or some other major journal will have an article on the future of the Earth based on population, and they always make predictions of size change in population size and what's going to happen. And what they predict never is actually what happens, because conditions change.
Yes.
And this is one of the reasons. This is one of the ways in which science denialism kind of takes root. Is people who are 40 or 50 years old remember 30 years ago and 20 years ago things being said that were going to happen, and those things didn't seem to happen. So you kind of wonder why are we listening to science today if they've been wrong every few decades?
Yeah, and that is one of the big things with science denialism, especially related to the global climate change.
Right.
Because they say, oh, they were predicting it was going to be cold now, but it's not. So obviously they have no idea what they're talking about.
Right. In fact, I was thinking this the other day about my own personal history there. I started getting interested in climate change in the early 80s when I was doing archaeology in the coastal regions in Massachusetts, and we're looking at sites being inundated by sea level rise. So I was studying past sea level rise and ice age climates. And really, my feeling at the time was, and this is true of scientists generally in the 70s, that and farther back, that ice ages were a concern and global warming was a concern. The truth is that the whole science behind global warming has been known for many, many decades. We're seeing now the outcome of what atmospheric physicists have predicted for a very long time. Nobody's surprised about anything that's happening now, and they haven't been. But there also have been ice ages. So there was a question for a while whether there was going to be an ice age or a global warming. In Canada, which is up north, even from Minnesota, it's actually even north of us, which is kind of hard to imagine how you would live up there, but people do.
Yep.
And the policy in the 60s and 70s for climate change research reports that got funded by the government was to always have an executive summary that addressed both cooling and warming. No matter what your research was, always address both cooling and warming, just to have the information evaluated that way on the table. But subsequently, my thoughts have changed from thinking about ice ages as an option and warming as an option to realizing that it's actually, we thought for a while that warming was going to forestall an ice age. So it might have negative effects, but it might actually have positive effects, because if we can just not have the ice age, that would be nice. And warming could make it not happen. And that kind of changed as research came in and changed our minds about things to indicate that perhaps warming effects would change the way that ocean currents operate, which would actually trigger an ice age, which was the basis of that movie, The Day After Tomorrow, that came out a few years ago, where they fall through the ceiling of the shopping center, which is covered with ice, and they all go to Mexico. That actually became it was an interesting hypothesis presented by Wally Broker. It's still a possibility that ocean currents can change because of global warming, but now it's starting to look like the amount of carbon in the atmosphere is going to be enough that, I like to think of it this way, what turns an ice age on or off over time is a little bit like a child on a swing. Once the kid's on the swing, you just have to push a little bit for the kid to go back and forth. Just a little push, the kid goes forward and back. There's these cycles that happen with very, very little pushes involved. And that's the climate cycles that happen in ice ages over the last 2 million years. But you can stop the kid by just grabbing it. Okay, and the ice age pushing back and forth, ice age to interglacial to ice age to interglacial, is something that happens when the carbon amount in the atmosphere is within a certain range. When it goes beyond that range, it doesn't happen like that anymore. It's like you got off the swing and you're doing something else now. Okay, so it no longer applies. And we're looking at carbon levels that are high enough that we may have different conditions when we would normally be having an ice age. It may be different, but it doesn't mean cooler. It may mean drier. It might mean something. Might be some different distribution of moisture or something like that. But it's quite possible that there'll be enough extra carbon released back into the atmosphere that used to be in the atmosphere, that's been trapped into fossil fuels, released back again, to cause the conditions to go back to the way that they were at the time that that carbon was out loose. Which means no ice on the poles. It means much, much higher sea levels. If you look at sea level rise estimates, you can go on various websites and play with the numbers. Like, what happens if we raise the sea level up 6 feet, to what happens to New Orleans, or what happens to New York? And you can watch the Google map change with the sea level coming up. Well, if you melted the ice caps, the difference would be about 360 feet.
360 feet?
Right. Wow. So New York would be a fishing ground if you lived in the Palisades, or you know, Brooklyn Heights would be just sticking up as an island. The states of Mississippi and
Florida?
Florida, yeah, they would all just be gone. You know, they would be gone pretty much. Because when sea level goes up, it doesn't only go up, it also goes across. It erodes. Okay, so even though there's places in Long Island that are more than 30 feet high, if sea level went up 10 feet, it would wipe those out horizontally over time. Now, keep in mind, what it would take to melt both poles is not something that's happening in the next few decades. I'm talking about a century or so from now.
So, but still not that far out in terms of just the world, in terms of time, in terms of human time.
There are people who can say, oh yeah, my great-grandfather was a famous global warming denialist. The bastard. You know, people will be able to say that. Living somewhere in a high ground.
Somewhere in the future and looking at that scary thing. So, so as we try and get people to start thinking more about that what's going into the atmosphere is affecting things and affecting how those cycles work, how do we get people to start thinking more scientifically on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's sort of the key question, and I actually, my view on that is something that when I say this to my colleagues, they usually stop listening and think I'm wrong. I've had this conversation. Science denialism is wider than global warming. So I've had this conversation regarding, as you mentioned, creationism going on now for several years. And when you talk to people who teach courses in college or high school teachers, or activists in the field, or science communicators, you know, after, you know, at a cocktail party and you're having a few beers and people are talking about this or whatever, you always hear the same thing, which is all you have to do is, and then there's a sentence or a paragraph about what the one thing that they know will work is. And people will tell you, I tell my students X, Y, Z in my classroom, and that's the solution. Okay. Now the thing is, all of the communicators and educators out there in the science fields have been doing this one thing that they know works for 30 years. It has not worked.
It's definitely not working.
So the thing where you tell your students is one thing that makes them all go, oh yeah, I got it all wrong. Okay. If you then point that out to people that that's not actually been working, then the response is, well, you can't convince people to change their minds. Okay. So we have, you know, we have two. It's like having soldiers in the field. These teachers and communicators and scientists are out there who all all know that the way to kill the enemy is to swing a rubber chicken around their head. And then you tell them, that doesn't work. And the answer is, well, then we just won't do anything. Okay? So nothing will work. So basically, we have been utterly ineffective and unable to do things. And I think that there isn't a single solution. There isn't a single way of doing this. Meantime, if you wanted to convince everyone that global warming is not real, there's a way to do that.
Okay.
And that is spend a lot of money on making sure that every way you think of to make people think that global warming is a hoax gets touched on. You talk to the editors of newspapers, you buy them. You buy the newspapers or the editors. You buy the publishers and the producers of news agencies and so on, and you get them to, for example, make sure that every news story that's reported has both sides of the story, that global warming is real, global warming is not, and so on. You spend piles of money on this. If you're the Koch brothers or a big oil company or the oil industry lobby, you spend a lot of money on a lot of things. And for good reasons. I mean, I worked in environmental impact statement writing for years. I worked with the power companies and people building sewers and bridges and so on. And people have irrational and inappropriate fears of bridges or sewers or power plants. They'll sit at home and using the electricity, but they won't think rationally about the power plant. So the power company has to go out there and make people understand we are upgrading the power lines in your backyards like we promised we would do someday when we bought the right-of-way and gave you that money. Remember? Yeah. And people will not understand that. So they have public relations offices for good reasons. Okay, but then they also have public relations offices for other reasons. Yes. Which is getting everyone basically to who make question and be critical of their approaches to look like they're wrong. And meanwhile, scientists who are fairly numerous. I mean, I was wondering. I was going to try to find this out before the show tonight, but I didn't do it. I'm wondering what the budget of the energy industries are for public relations compared to, say, the National Science Foundation and the NIH.
I would say that it's going to be one of those graphs that's going to be kind of like this.
They probably have more money in public relations than all of the money spent on science research.
Probably.
Or some crazy, I didn't say that, I'm not saying that's true, but it's going to be something like that.
Oh, yeah.
So getting denialism to work has been effective in part, but not entirely, because more effort's been put into it and more money's been put into it. Okay, that's not the entire story, but that's a very large part of it, I think.
And that makes it really tough. And then we also see things coming in from the religious right, because they have these things called something with the green dragon that's being put together out there that's talking about the evils of environmentalism and sort of saying, well, they're going to want to do the population control like they are in China with the the one-child rule, just sort of totally ignoring the fact that yes, population is growing and it's time to sort of face that fact.
Yeah, the connection between global warming and creationism via religion is an interesting one, because they really are different issues with different people with different stakes in them. Yet there's a lot of overlap. There are some people who are obviously. A couple years ago, a person in the Seattle-Tacoma area tried to get his school board to go along with an equal time for global warming as well as creationism. And he put the things together. And he basically, he was using the argument that, which is a common argument made by religious groups, that either we are stewards of the planet, or this planet's here to serve us, or God will take care of it. So one of those kinds of arguments for global warming. And his idea, I think, was building large nuclear-powered fans to blow the heat away over the city. And when he got to that point, when he was explaining to the school board how equal time is necessary for these things, you can't just let the scientists have their say in the schoolroom. You also have to have equal time from other people. They were listening to that, because that's what school boards do. And when he got up to the nuclear-powered fans being mounted over the cities, they realized that they had let someone in the door. They weren't. It was kind of embarrassing. But by that time, it had become a national news story. And this was, so there's that. There's people who really do are a bit off, and I think they have this connection. Creationism and religion play better when you have done damage to science, when you can say science is not a very good place to find things out. And doing damage to science through global warming denialism probably facilitates the creationist agenda.
Yeah, and we're seeing that is like in I believe it's Tennessee, where they're going to allow them to build not just the Creation Museum, but the Ark Park.
Right.
which is a very scary concept.
Yes, and that is the major global climate change event of the Bible, is the Noachian flood.
Yes, yes. Even though when you start looking at the science of that, that's when your head explodes, because it's like, no, sorry, it doesn't work at all. That was one of the things that actually brought me over, is reading that story. It's like, okay, the elements are not working together here.
Yeah.
So, so we've got that part of it, and you say that goes over into creationism. So evolution is also the other thing, that understanding our biology is very important. So how can we also work on making that subject better, and making people better informed about that?
Yeah, and again, it comes back to the same thing initially, where although I think the answer to why global warming denialism has cachet does relate very directly to the medical and biological issues in science. Okay. I remember working several years ago at a think tank, a major think tank out east. I was an administrator, not a thinker. And the people who were there would later become things like secretary of this or that in the government, or president of Harvard. There was pretty big thinkers there. And this is actually the place where, one of the two or three places where the whole idea that we now accept as true, although it's overstated, that humans can't think rationally, we're bad at probability, that kind of thing. This is where this research came out of.
Okay.
So these are people thinking about humans being bad at making decisions. And one day, a news report came out that said, drinking coffee is bad for you. Okay, so all of these researchers, scientists and economists mostly, cut back on their coffee a little bit.
Okay.
Like, instead of drinking 4 cups, they drank 3 cups, or they make the fourth one half decaf. They cut back a little bit.
Okay.
And then a couple weeks later, another news report came out that said that research indicated that coffee wasn't bad for you, might even be good for you. So they all increased their coffee consumption considerably.
Okay.
And of course, everyone was joking about this. They were quite self-aware that they were, first of all, not being critical of it at all. They were not even researching the original research. They were not looking into the original scientific work. They were not testing the veracity of the news reports, and they were reacting in an irrational manner. And they were quite well aware of this. So these are people whose business is to tell everyone else that we're not rational, but themselves were acting irrationally and cognizant of it and joking about it, because it wasn't a very serious thing. It was not exactly like giving up smoking. It was just drinking more or less coffee. Okay, but it kind of shows that it's actually an example of a lot of things. An example of how poorly scientific research is represented in the press. It is very often the case, as a blogger, I search the peer-reviewed literature for interesting stories to write about on my blog. And I often see a press report and the scientific article, and I try to cover mostly areas that I know something about. And I can't tell you how often it is the case that there's an article on some interesting cellular process or physiological process in the body, in which the research, when I read the paper, I see nothing that has to do with cancer. I don't see it in there at all. And then the public report, the press report, will say, this will lead to a cure for cancer potentially. And then I see, oh yeah, I see that if you want, because cancer is cells, and this is about cells.
Yeah.
Therefore, knowing more about cells, it is always good to know more about cells, and maybe there will be a link someday, but it's really not cancer research. But if you can make a link to cancer, then you have an article that will be of more interest. That's fairly egregious, unethical reporting.
Yes.
It is coming out of the press offices of a university and being fed to reporters who uncritically repeat it in the newspapers.
Wow.
Okay, and that's not everything, but it's kind of normal for that to happen. So, in my view, the average citizen who isn't a scientist in a certain area is more comfortable with themselves if they can say that science is screwed up rather than I don't understand it.
Yeah.
And if you're a reporter, it's actually job preservation to say the scientists are always changing their minds. The scientists are always contradicting themselves, and it's not me that's stupid, or at least look at the monkey over here while I'm being stupid. You're distracting the audience from your own inability to understand and report what you're seeing, with the fact that science is always contradicting itself, so it doesn't really matter anyway. When I write a blog post about a very simple story that might be of interest to someone, an asteroid is passing near the Earth right now, for example. So I write that up. And get to the end of it, it's like, okay, as a writer, I feel unsatisfied. This story didn't go anywhere. There's an asteroid passing by the Earth. So what? I mean, it's interesting to me because I like asteroids, but the story needs an ending. And then I stop myself and I just publish a blog post as an uninteresting ending, because I don't want to add what's obvious, which is something about asteroids hitting the Earth.
True.
Yeah, this asteroid's not going to hit the Earth. They're actually passing by the Earth all the time. They never hit the Earth. You know, asteroids hitting the Earth is interesting and important, but it doesn't have anything to do with this asteroid. You know, but if I was an editor reading that piece for my newspaper, I'd send it back to the writer and say, add something about asteroids hitting the Earth.
Yes.
Please, to make it interesting. There has to be that catch in there. And the easiest way to make the catch when you're reporting science is to just acknowledge, or falsely point to the fact that science is always contradicting itself. Report the new finding about this food that makes you ill, end it with saying, but I'm sure they're going to find out how this is good for you in the end. There's always a contradiction. Pointing at those things. So it's a device that reporters and editors use to make the stories work better in their newspapers, to link them to things people are related to when there not really is a link, or there isn't really a link. And this all ends up with the science that we are faced with as citizens, the science that's in our popular press, on TV, in newspapers, and so on. It's all bad science, and it looks wishy-washy.
Yes.
It looks like there's always two sides to a story. Whereas, you know, in science, there's almost never two sides to a story.
There's usually just one with that wee bit of a possibility of doubt, but
and then
pretty much you're over there on the fairly certain end of it.
Right, at the level that we're talking most of the time. You know, and so I think that the problem with evolution and creationism is, with the idea of evolution and as important, and the biology is important, is that that's where most of these stories come from. Most of the cosmic stories about other planets, stories about neutrinos going faster than the speed of light, you know, that's all interesting, but it doesn't affect your day-to-day life too much. At least people don't think it does. Had they actually created a black hole at CERN and destroyed the Earth, that would have been notable. But really,
we were around to read the story. Yes.
Right. The real stories of interest are the ones about your health.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. And that is where you see these contradictions being made that are false contradictions. And in fact, research is a little complicated. It is often hard to tell why something is important. You know, so when you have the biology being reported, the health, which is mostly biology, being reported in that way, it's very easy to go into the biology class as a student, as a high school student, and be very cynical about what you're going to learn there. And if someone's come along and whispered in your ear every Sunday for your whole life, be careful when you get into biology class, because they're going to tell you stuff.
Yes.
Here's what they're going to tell you, and here's the real story. Then you end up being very cynical, and if you're beyond that told, by the way, while you're there, your fellow students are being told the same thing. Please try to help them.
Yeah.
And you become a little evangelical student or whatever, then that just simply, our high schools are breeding grounds for science denialism. Yeah. Turns out.
Which means once we get the ones interested and into college, they've got a lot of backfilling to do in order to get caught up on that process.
Right.
You know, and that fits into, you know, what we talk about, one of the basic consensus of humanism is that knowledge of the world is derived by observation, experimentation, and rational analysis. And then another second one is that humans are an integral part of nature, the result of unguided evolutionary change. You know, so that's reason why this is important for us, because it will affect our day in and day out lives. As you mentioned, you know, the changes in agriculture, we're at the limit on what we can produce for food for people. So with population going up and fisheries going down and that sort of things, bad things are converging.
Right. And by the way, I mentioned before that when you look back at what scientists have always said about population size and so on, and it always seems like it's been inaccurate. That's actually inaccurate, because I just wanted to sort of clarify, yes, it is true that when you look in the future, when you look at the year 2000, when you're only in 1970, you're going to get a lot of stuff wrong.
Yes.
Right now, we're looking at the population has reached a certain point, so that caused demographers to come out with their predictions. And now they're coming out typically with multiple alternatives, like depends on what happens. Okay. But one of my favorites is, you know, people always complain about the environmental movement, always says disaster is going to happen and never actually occurs. Well, that's just not true. Okay.
Correct.
Back in the 60s, they said, now it's not a big problem in Minnesota, but out east, they said that the rain would be so acidic it would wash the paint off your car. Okay. You know what happened? They changed the paint.
Yes.
Still washes the paint off your car. If you have old paint, an old car, it's been washed off by acid rain.
Yes.
Okay. The acid rain has been reduced by curbing air pollution in the Midwest.
Right.
But there's still acid rain, and it's still true that salmon and trout no longer breed in streams in New York State. they're gone.
Yes.
Okay, unless they're without rangers out there putting baby salmon and trout in these streams in the Adirondacks, they will go extinct. So, because of acid rain. So, there's many examples of dire predictions being made that were wrong. There's also many predictions of dire predictions being made where that caused something to happen, like the EPA got created.
Yes.
Dire predictions were made about what would happen with Lake Superior, given what was being done in northern Minnesota.
Oh, yeah.
They changed what they were doing. They were forced to change. And that's why it didn't happen, not because they were wrong about the prediction, but because the science said this was going to happen, the environmental evidence was present, and legislation actually happened, and changes were actually made.
So so there are cases where that actually helps, and people see and say, yes, I can see that this is going to be a bad thing. We need to make these course corrections now, and then that's where it affects it. And the same probably happened with population as well in the 70s, where they were predicting the Malthusian sort of things going on, where people said, that's a distinct possibility. We can look, on that, and that has sort of adjusted things, even though we're still not slowing down anywhere where we need to.
Yeah, we're not.
It does help.
I remember another prediction that happened, or a crisis that occurred. It was in the 70s, I believe. Where the meat crisis. Do you remember the meat crisis? The price of meat went way up. There's actually a Frank Zappa song in which he says the part of the line is the price of meat is just going up. I won't say what the rest of the line is though. So the price of meat went up, and it became hard to get, and it was like the oil crisis, but it was with meat.
Right.
And then it was probably a false shortage, and there were various reasons it happened. But prior to that meat crisis, the problems that people don't like what's happening in the meat industry now. People don't like the feedlots in Nebraska and that kind of stuff, right? Well, that all happened because of that.
Okay.
Because there was a demand for meat to increase productivity, and it's been addressed by changing the practices of raising cattle for meat and chickens.
That affects things. So we're down to about the last bit. What is the best thing we can do? And I know you say one thing doesn't work, but just to start moving people away from being denialists of what's going on with science.
I think what has to happen is actually in the press and in that arena. I think it has to be the case that when, for example, global warming in particular, when climate science is being reported, the idea that there's another side or two sides to the story just simply has to be recognized as unethical reporting. I think that the agencies that do things like give out Emmys or other awards, Peabodys, whatever they are, to people in journalism, they shouldn't be giving awards to journalistic agencies that when it comes to hunting season have a story about how to avoid running into Bigfoot.
There we go.
Okay, and then extend that out to climate change, creationism, and everything else.
So we can work on that by educating those. And, you blog, so I think that helps as well getting on there. So thank you very much, Greg. Appreciate you being here. Covered a lot of stuff and got a lot of good information out. So for more information on the Humanists of Minnesota and what we do, you can contact us through our website. You can send us an old-fashioned letter. You can give us a phone call. We'd like to hear what you think of this program and topics you'd like to see us cover on future programs. Thank you for joining me on this edition of Humanist Views. I'm Scott Lohman. Good night.